So can we start, please, with some biographical information? So your name, your date and place of birth, and your current status, please.
Sure. My name is Martin Staum, and my status is emeritus at the University of Calgary. I retired from teaching in 2008, and my place of birth is Perth Amboy, New Jersey, in July 9th, 1943.
Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about your background, your education, and your upbringing, please?
Well, my upbringing was in, I would guess, what you would describe as a middle-class home. My father was a tailor by training, and he worked in a factory, and then he became eventually an independent businessman by managing a factory. I was an only child, so my upbringing was generally a happy one. None of the complexes of the only child. And I went to university at Princeton, and then I took my doctorate, my graduate studies and doctorate at Cornell.
And would you say that politics was an important feature in your upbringing, in your family? Were there many political discussions?
Yes, I think there was always interest in politics. And I pulled the famous mistake I made when I was 5 years old. I was told that my grandfather thought that Truman was kind of incompetent and that Dewey was a better candidate. So I went to a doctor's appointment, and the doctor asked this 5-year-old, "Who do you favor for in the coming election?" And I said Dewey, which was to the great embarrassment of my parents, who were ardent Democrats.
So politics was a common theme of discussion. Okay, and were you politically active or socially active in any way prior to 1968?
Well, I suppose the one great experience I had before 1968 was the participation in the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. I had a good friend who was working in the Senate office of Clifford Case, senator from New Jersey. And I went to meet him, and I actually marched with him as if I were a Capitol Hill employee. But that was quite an experience. I never actually heard the Martin Luther King speech in person. I only heard clips from it afterward. But I was present, at least for the first part of that march. And it gave me also an experience in what it must be to be a member of a visible minority, because as a white person there, I was a visible minority. And I thought, at one point I thought, well, I feel a little bit isolated. And then I caught myself and I thought, what's this whole day about? It's about being together. And I also realized that perhaps if you're an African American, that you might feel a little isolated all the time. In the wrong surroundings anyway.
Yeah.
So that was probably the high point of political activity. Of course, it turned out to be a very peaceful day, which you would never know from the Capitol Hill police stationed all around with their batons ready. But there was no violence.
So what took you to France in 1968?
Doctoral research.
And what were you doing? Where were you? What were your living conditions? What were you doing on a daily basis before things took off in France? What was your day-to-day?
Sorry, I'm losing your volume there.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I just lost the last sentence there.
Okay. Yeah. So can you tell me where you were staying Where were you in Paris? Where were you staying? What were your living conditions? What was your day to day?
Yes, I was in Paris in the Fondation des États-Unis. And there were friends from various other houses nearby. There was a fellow I met over breakfast from Iran, and he told me how the events in Paris were making him feel young again. And then some years later, I saw him on television as a spokesman for the Ayatollah.
Very good.
That was a surprise. But I lived, except for 2 weeks at the beginning when I was in a hotel, I lived all the time in the Fondation des États-Unis. So that's part of the Cité Universitaire. It was very much a student environment.
And what date did you arrive in France? Were you there from 1967 or?
67, 68. It was a full year, almost an academic year, from September 67 to September 68.
And what did you make of student life in France at that time?
Well, I knew there were problems with working conditions for students. I mean, I wasn't directly involved because I wasn't really taking courses. But I remember in the fall of 1967, UNET distributed a flyer saying something like, "Give us the means and we'll be able to do the work." So I was already aware before the spring of 68 that students had complaints, but I didn't have that much actual contact with French students per se. I mean, the milieu in the Fondation des États-Unis was either American or foreign students.
And did you think that? When things started to kick off, did it come as a surprise to you, or was there a sense that something was bubbling up?
Well, something did bubble up in April, right in where I lived.
Okay.
And at the time, I didn't know that the rules about access to dormitories were already an issue with French students, because I learned that much later. And I took a look the last few days at your book and skimmed a few pages of Michael Seidman. And I realize now that this issue of access to dormitories was a very hot button type of issue. And the way it came up at the Fondation des États-Unis was that some guys probably had been caught. You know, I don't know the exact details, but some guys were caught in the women's wing, and it was strictly prohibited to go into the women's dormitory wing. And so the director, who was a retired military officer, wanted to institute disciplinary measures. Mm-hmm. And he met the committee of students, and he said, "I'm going to put in an armored door." So the reaction of the students was to say that there's only one staircase, and this would be a fire hazard if you put in an armored door. And his reply was, "Well, in that case, you'll be well roasted." So from that point on, there was a kind of state of war between the student council and the director. And what happened was that other students from other houses sort of joined demonstrations against the director. And he probably didn't realize how social customs were changing, not only in France, but also in the United States, because he was living in Paris. And it's true that if you went into a French hotel, I remember one case where they wouldn't even allow you to talk to a woman in the lounge of the hotel. You know, so certainly there were a lot of restrictive regulations, even in the wider world outside of the student milieu. But anyway, what happened is that there were demonstrations against the director, and students from other houses joined them. And the director and the administrative staff one evening just locked all the doors. So the students who were chanting and making a rumpus outside decided that if they can't get in through the doors, they'll get in through the windows. And there was a big salon. They proceeded to break the windows. And in fact, the American students were not altogether so happy about breaking the windows because they were used to the idea that property damage is something that you don't do if you can avoid it. So the French students laughed at us and said, "You don't know how to demonstrate. The university budgets for broken windows." This was all happening in late April of '68. And so, although it didn't relate directly to the events in the Latin Quarter, it sort of signaled to me that things were restless in the student world.
And as a foreign student at the time, or someone from a different country, was the international situation something that people talked about? Were there any particular issues from an international perspective that were feeding into that sense that something was happening?
Yes, I think the Vietnam War was uppermost in the minds of a lot of students, including the American students. And I remember meetings in which Vietnamese students spoke. But there are all sorts of gradations of opinion relative to the Vietnam War. I think most of us in the American House were opposed, though not perhaps to the extent of wishing the other side to win. And what struck me was that when the students from South Vietnam who were in favor of the Viet Cong, when they spoke, it was almost like a parroting of a party line. You know, it wasn't, there wasn't any open-mindedness there either. And they tried to explain how when they killed people, it was done stealthily at night, and they'd sneak up and slit someone's throat, and this was far superior and far more honorable to bombing from an airplane. So, but certainly, attitudes toward the Vietnam War, I think, were clearly in everyone's mind, and they were internationally, as I understand what went on in Germany and other places, that the Vietnam War was a major issue.
And you mentioned earlier how social customs were beginning to change. Was there any sense that, from a cultural perspective, that sort of perhaps generational difference was starting to make itself felt? I'm referring to music, fashion, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that was going on, although I'm not the best person to ask about that because I was never a rock enthusiast. But I can remember when I was a fourth year student in high school, which would have been 1960, so very early on, my English teacher said, "They're listening to the most antisocial music." So that was the reaction of an older person as early as 1960. And of course, first with Elvis Presley and later with the Beatles, I mean, certainly there were some generational differences.
And was this your first experience of France, or had you been before?
Once before, in 1965, I went as a tourist, and I was at the Alliance Française for about a month. And then I went on a tour of Italy, Germany, and Austria. And in 1965, we stayed in it wasn't that expensive a hotel, but it wasn't a cheap one either. It was in the either the 8th or the 16th arrondissement. And we asked the concierge for her feelings about General de Gaulle. And she said I would kiss his feet. She was someone who had lived through the war and talked about how food rations were so meager during the war. So she regarded de Gaulle as a great hero.
And was that generational shift something that was tangible, something that was important at the time? Could you feel it?
Well, I think afterward, when all kinds of authority was being questioned, it was clear to me that it was young people that were doing a lot of the questioning. But I don't know if I could have predicted that before.
Okay, so how did you start to become involved when things started to really kick off when we move into the early days of May 1968?
Well, I witnessed a number of things, but I tried to stay away from clashes with the police because I wanted to be a historian in France. And I thought that the quickest way to end my career was to get in trouble with the police and lose my visa and be kicked out of the country. So I deliberately set certain limitations. I mean, I remember there was a young woman in our building who came back from a demonstration singing Ave Maria. And say, I wouldn't have been that close, but I did witness a few events. One was the May 13th march, and that was a very calm atmosphere. You know, like everyone else, I read in the papers about all the police brutality and the clubbing of students and so forth. And although I wasn't directly involved, what struck me was the sympathy that so many people had for the students. It's very different from what later, from the way I understand the events in Chicago unfolded, where Americans would think, well, these guys had it coming to them. If they're being beaten up, they deserve to be beaten up. That wasn't at all the vibe that I got in France. Brutality is brutality. And the way it was reported in the papers, the police were chasing people into apartments on the street, and in some cases running after women and saying, strip the brat. It was almost like an uncontrolled situation. It's only recently that I've read, I'm not sure whether it was in your book or someone else's book, that there were actually negotiations between the crowd and the police, and that the police were not completely out of control. But anyway, for my personal involvement was with the Great March, and the one in which the gauchistes led the parade, and as Cohn-Bendit said, the Stalinist filth was in the caboose. And that was, there were people chanting 10 ans, ça suffit, I remember that. Yeah. But it was a calm atmosphere. The police were not visible. Sure, they were not far away, but they were not visible. And shopkeepers in the Latin Quarter were certainly nervous, but there was no sort of outburst that marred that event.
And what did you think of les gauchistes like Daniel Cohn-Bendit and his band of merry men? What did you think of those guys at the time?
Well, I probably thought that they were a bit far out. I wondered how practical their prescriptions were. I mean, I get some pleasure from reading Cohn-Bendit in his book Obsolete Communism. He's really sticking it to the capitalist world. But on the other hand, I wondered about their ability to organize. And they did. Certainly they had a presence in UNEF. They had a presence in the teachers' union in SNASUP. And they had interesting, if not always appealing, ideas. But there was also an air of unreality. What's going to happen if there's a real challenge from the government? And I remember I went to the Odeon, and people were writing out communiques as if this were the commune or, you know, or a revolutionary committee. They were just sitting there, even using the dates of the revolutionary calendar at one point.
And what did you make of all that? Did you think it was symbolic, playful, or was it serious?
Well, they thought it was serious, but I wondered to myself, you know, what if the government takes the attitude that later the Chinese took? You know, what if the tanks come in to break this up? You know, what's going to happen? And we didn't know, by the way, at the end, there was a rumor in the last days of May that there were tanks surrounding Paris. We didn't know that inside the city. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it struck me that they were in this kind of visionary state that, you know, they think they're making the revolution. And to some extent, you could say it was a revolutionary situation later in May. But did they really have a program or leadership? You know, I mean, this is the problem. There was a man at the Odeon who spoke and said, "Je suis un ancien combattant." And immediately there was hissing and jeering, you know, the idea of a veteran speaking. And then he finished his sentence. He said, "Un ancien combattant du Front Populaire." And the gist of what he said was the warning that this all could be broken apart.
Very good. And did you take part in any of the occupations that took place in the university faculties, or even in your own building where you were staying?
No, I went to the Sorbonne courtyard and I saw some of the things that were going on. I mean, it was, I didn't go inside where people were staying for the night, but there were desks inside the courtyard, and every cause that you could think of was there. I mean, like there were, I didn't realize, by the way, until I looked at your book, how important Brittany was in this whole episode. Because one of the tables inside the courtyard of the Sorbonne was Bretagne Libre.
All right.
Yeah.
Very good.
And now I realize there was a whole history behind that Bretagne Libre. Not only the ordinary regional movement, but what was happening during the days of early May.
Yeah. So was there no sense that this was a nationwide revolt, and was there a sense that this was just happening in Paris?
Well, we just didn't know. I don't think there was that much publicity about the provincial uprisings. I mean, we knew afterward. The only time I remember them talking about somebody being killed in May as contrasted to June was a truck rolled down a hill in Lyon and crushed someone. So I mean, we knew that there were demonstrations in other cities. And there must have been some reporting on the radio. I didn't have that much access to television. There was one common television in the Salon. But I think I got most of my news from the radio. And of course, the journalists overworked themselves and did a fabulous job taking over for the ORTF staff. You know, but we didn't know about people directing traffic in Nantes, for example. You know, this whole commune established in Nantes. We didn't know anything about that.
Okay, that's interesting. And how did things progress then as the general strike started to take hold? How did you live day to day? Was it difficult? Was it enjoyable? Was it frightening? How would you describe it?
Well, it was both exhilarating and frightening at the same time. I mean, that's, I think, the memory I have at May. I mean, it was exhilarating because things were happening. It's sort of, as you pointed out when you're writing about Herbert Marcuse, this is the great refusal, you know, and that part had an exciting character to it. Frightening in two ways. one, I couldn't do my work, so that I didn't know how long that would last. You know, the library's closed.
Right.
And the second thing was that it was so unpredictable. Some of the students in our house would say, well, if things turn out poorly, I'll go to my relatives in the country. You know, but of course the American students generally didn't have relatives in the country.
And as a foreign student, I mean, was it particularly difficult to be there, or did you feel as though you could take part, or were you advised to not take part? Or
well, with me, it was a sort of self-imposed. I mean, there were some students who got closer to the police lines, and one guy paid the price for it. He had welts all over his back from getting beaten up, and he thought he could wave his American passport and he'd be exempt, but that didn't work out. But otherwise, there wasn't a sense of immediate danger. I mean, the food supply was there, and I didn't have a car, so I wasn't worried about the gasoline. But there wasn't a point at which it appeared some kind of military coup was imminent. And we didn't know what was happening in the last days of May. And I guess there's still some controversy about what really happened.
yeah, well, yeah, as I say in the book, there's kind of three different hypotheses about what happened, and yeah, it adds to the mystery of it all. In your halls of residence, what was going on there? Was it part of the movement? Were you up talking?
Actually, I didn't finish my story about April. I'll just add one little bit about April, because that was the moment in which I personally was in the greatest danger, I guess. The people were chanting after they broke into the American house and saying, "Liberté à la cité, liberté à la cité." Well, they found some poor guy on the fourth floor who was German. And they said, "There's a fascist who lives here." And this was the same floor I was on, and they were saying, "Let's break everything on this floor." So like a bloody fool, I stood in the doorway. And fortunately, I wasn't hurt. They just pushed me aside. And I was screaming at them, "Calm down this guy, calm down this guy." And they did. So in the end, they didn't hurt the German guy either, and they didn't break anything. So that was the moment when I was in the greatest personal danger. But later on during May, it was just a matter of staying clear of trouble. I mean, I was near when they had the big rally at the Stade Charléty. I was actually right outside. I didn't go in, but I was right outside. You could hear some things on the loudspeaker. But as I understand it, the opposition really missed their chance. Neither Mendes France nor Mitterrand was ready to step up and take advantage of the situation. And one memory I had, which is very vivid of that day, was an elderly French gentleman looking at the gate to the stadium and seeing that they had put up the red flag. And this obviously didn't go over with him at all. He said, if only they would put up un drapeau français.
Very good. And what was the atmosphere like towards the end of May? Was it one of
increased nervousness, I think. I mean, for one thing, at least up until de Gaulle's speech, the strikes were continuing and spreading, and no one knew where they would end. And the reaction of the government was still sort of problematic. We had no idea how the government would respond. You just see I've lost some lighting. I'm just going to turn on this.
Okay, yeah. And can you remember when de Gaulle disappeared and went to Baden-Baden. Do you remember that incident, or was it something you
Yes,
weren't?
I mean, of course, I didn't know until afterward that that's what happened, that he went to Baden-Baden. I mean, I think I heard the radio broadcasts that he was missing. And
Okay.
I do remember more vividly his speech when he said, "Je ne me retirerai pas," with such determination. Actually, the speeches of de Gaulle were something incredible to us because the way they were presented was like Louis XIV is talking to you. You know, there was Baroque music, and then they said, "General de Gaulle vous parle." More Baroque music, and then he'd come on. I don't know if you remember the speech that he made about a petit ange. This was, I think, this was after May happened. It must have been in June or sometime later. And I don't remember who the interviewer was, but he said something like, there was a crowd sort of bent on doing evil things.
Oh, yes, yes. That was it.
In the corner of the painting, there's a little angel on petit ange that was leading them to the right path.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the famous speech when he describes the events as insaisissable, you know, this elusiveness to the, it was with Michel Droit on television. It's quite well known. I'm going to ask you a couple of quite specific things to see if you have any comment on them. So one of the sort of myths, or one of the common characteristics associated with May, is that there was an attempt apparently by students to forge some contacts with workers, and I wondered if you had any experience of that or saw any coming together of students and workers during the events.
No, I mean, I'm interested in that idea because that would, in a way, invalidate the great fallacy that students and workers didn't have any contact. But unfortunately, I can't confirm any of that because I didn't know any factory workers.
And you didn't encounter any workers or in any of the occupied faculties or the Sorbonne or the Odeon or anywhere like that?
Well, there must have been some there, you know, but I perhaps wasn't there long enough to show that. I mean, even in the occupations that directly concerned us, there were American students at the Sancier Student Center who wanted to come and occupy our building, but that was over Vietnam, and we eventually convinced them that we're against the war too, so there's no point in occupying our building. But I didn't myself go into the Sorbonne for long enough to see if there were any factory workers there, and there must have been some in various committees that sprang up throughout the city, but yeah, I didn't encounter any.
Okay, another common characteristic of these events is this notion of la prise de parole, this idea that everybody was talking and everyone was talking to each other. Was that something that you experienced at the time? And could you say a few words about that and whether it was important?
Well, I think we did talk more than usual about politics and where it was all going, but I'm not sure that there would have been a discontinuity there. I think, you know, students always talk to each other. And one thing that's often said about the social changes is that somehow this was a period where women's rights were discussed and came to the fore. And I'm sorry to say I have no recollection of that whatsoever. You know, and
So was it a very male-oriented or a male-dominated event in your memory?
Well, I wouldn't say it was male dominated in the sense that women didn't participate. They did participate, but I don't recall discussions of women's rights per se, you know, or issues that might have concerned women,
Mhm.
issues that later became the themes of feminism, like abortion rights or fertility and so forth. I mean, these things that eventually were adopted by the government. But I don't see 1968 somehow as being the great forerunner of that.
No.
No.
Common, contrary to popular myth. You've already mentioned the role of the police, and I just wondered if you thought that it would be fair to describe May '68 as a violent revolt.
Well, there was violence in the sense of clashes with police. I mean, from the one. I remember one of the things that a student in our building did say. He said that the police shouldn't have been there. And in a certain respect, you can see where he's coming from, because the police entering the precincts of the university was already a violation of the traditional privileges of the university. But on the other hand, we who read French history know the revolutionary past. And if you say the police shouldn't have been there, are you saying that they should have given in to whatever demands that were being made, you know? So, I mean, there is something to be said for the government side of posting the police, although I think there's nothing to excuse the kind of clubbing of students and chasing of students that took place.
And were you fearful of the police?
Well, I wanted to stay away mainly because of, you know, the peril of losing my status, losing my visa. And, you know, when I returned to France in subsequent years in the 1970s, they always looked a little bit more closely at the record from '68. There wasn't anything on my record, but they always looked because they knew I was there in '68.
Okay, interesting.
One of the questions I actually wanted to bring up with you, it's not on the,
Go ahead.
it occurred to me, I don't know how much this has been emphasized in the literature, the question of whether a revolution can happen in an advanced, developed country. And does a revolution have to be violent? And it struck me that the full significance of '68 might not have been observable until '89, you know, when there were revolutions in Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And except for Romania, were largely peaceful revolutions.
But do you think that at the time the people who were involved in '68 were actually striving for revolution, or were they just striving for reform? Because it's often a point of debate.
Yeah, well, that's probably the difference between some of the student leaders and, or maybe in some cases, even factory worker leaders, and the vast majority. I would have to speculate without, you know, knowing empirically, but I have to speculate that the vast majority of students and workers wanted reform. And in the case of the workers, of course, they eventually settled for the substance of the Grinnell agreements. How much people thought about things like autogestion, you know, it was a very good slogan, but how many people really would have fought for autogestion?
Yeah.
And in the case of the students, I mean, clearly the majority of students were not gauchistes, but the leaders were.
Yeah. Another point that I wanted to raise was, so we now know with hindsight that um, France was just one of many countries that was experiencing this wave of revolt in the year 1968, or Les années 68, as they're called, to try and give it a broader time frame. And I wondered if at the time people were aware that this was happening in other countries, similar type revolts.
Yes, I think so. I mean, it wasn't maybe a daily topic of discussion, but I recall a march where someone was carrying a placard which said Berlin, Varsovie, Madrid, Paris. So, and that's not even thinking about Prague.
Yeah.
So,
Well, you haven't come up with it.
yes, in fact, I knew a woman who was going to go to Prague in August, and she found out she couldn't go.
Not such a good idea. You mentioned briefly some of the politicians, and I just wondered if you can remember what the feeling was about the way in which the politicians responded to the events. So I'm thinking principally of De Gaulle, Pompidou, Mitterrand, Mendes France, the sort of political elite at the time.
Well, clearly at the beginning, they didn't understand the magnitude of the movement, or what the magnitude of the movement could become, because Pompidou was away. I think it was Iran and Afghanistan that he went to, looking for oil, probably. And De Gaulle had that scheduled trip to Romania, so, and then he came back with his cryptic saying, "La réforme, oui, la Chine, no."
Classic.
Yeah. And in the case of the Communist Party, it seems to me that Marchais' reaction at first was that the diligent students want to study, and these guys are preventing them from studying. It's only afterward that they sort of jumped on the bandwagon of the workers' movement, and even then they didn't encourage the strikes. They were wildcat strikes. I have one of my vivid memories of listening on the radio is the day that the Grenelle Accords were rejected, because you could hear Georges Séguy reading the Accords, and then a chorus of no, no, no. And then he was saying, well, they will be applied as modalities permit.
Yeah, very important moment when, it's a great speech to listen to, and you can feel him losing the crowd and starts to backtrack on what he was trying to get them to agree to. It's very interesting. So when things come to a conclusion, then in June '68, when de Gaulle wins the election, or the Gaullists win the election, what was your overriding feeling? Was it one of disappointment or relief?
Well, probably more of relief than disappointment, because I wasn't sure where things were leading. But I mean, as you have pointed out, June is in a way more serious than May, because that's when people were killed. And there wasn't a terrific amount of publicity about the events of June. I think after de Gaulle's speech, people thought that things are returning to normal. And the union leaders and the politicians also acted as if the elections were a return to normal. There was relief in the personal sense that I could get back to work. And also there was relief in the sense that I wouldn't worry about the unpredictability of events. But there was also disappointment at the the end of the creative period. And after all, it wasn't, as they say, a triumph of the imagination, and there's some disappointment in losing that. And I thought of Renoir's saying about that little flame that never dies. He said about the commune, and there's something about, I wouldn't say they were madmen, though, which was the first part of his quotation about the commune. But the little flame that never dies, I think that's what makes 68 so fascinating.
So what did you do for the summer of '68?
Well, I continued my research, and as an interesting postscript, there was a History of Science Congress, and my supervisor came over to give a paper. And just as we were having coffee, or standing outside a cafe, we saw about a block away, the police started to fire tear gas. So we sort of took him very quickly, whisked him down the metro staircase. And he said, "This is what my students have learned in Paris."
Real education.
Yeah.
What did you?
I had copies of the underground L'Enragé.
Oh yeah.
I gave them all to our library. I hope the library saved them. But
I hope so.
there were about 10 issues of that came out.
Yeah. There was lots of that kind of feeds into that whole prise de parole, another manifestation of that desire to get the ideas out there. What did your friends and family think of your being in France while this was going on?
Well, my parents actually visited at the beginning of May, and they got one of the last TWA flights out of Paris. So while that must have been comforting to them, I think they might have been concerned afterward at what was happening. I had a set of letters that I wrote to them, but that all got lost when they moved. So I don't have a record of what I said at the time. But I'm sure that, like other parents, they would have been concerned about the instability, possible danger.
And would they have been able to follow what was going on?
Insofar, it would have been covered in papers like the New York Times, because they were avid readers of the Times.
Okay. How did you perceive the impact of the events on France, sort of from a short-term perspective and then from a more long-term perspective?
Well, of course, the first reaction is what happened. Did anything happen? Is it a watershed or not? And certainly from the perspective of university students, it seems to me something did happen, not immediately, but with the couple of years that followed, the attempts at autonomy of universities, the end of the cours magistral, I shouldn't say the end of it, but the increasing proliferation of travaux dirigés and seminars and whatnot. What changed, I think, is attitudes of hierarchy. That seems to me, I mean, it is symbolized at the Bibliothèque Nationale, where there was a comité des lecteurs. I don't know of anyone consulting a comité des lecteurs before, but finally they had one. And I think that hierarchies got shaken up, even if the general social order did not change. I mean, I don't know if any more workers' sons and daughters ended up going to university than before. Still a pretty low percentage. Mm-hmm. But the idea that authority can always dictate what happens, seems to me that attitude changed somewhat. And maybe it opened the way for other causes. I mean, I said I don't see the direct connection to feminism. I don't see the direct connection to the ecologiste either, except personally in the case of Cohn-Bendit. But maybe it opened the way for other causes in later years, even though it was not a direct effect of May 68. As far as, my estimate of French politics and society, it struck me that it's always been volatile. I mean, if you read enough French history, you realize that there's these cataclysmic events every now and then. And of course, the ability to mobilize people and get them out on the streets, that's one of the most remarkable features of French political life. I mean, there's the labor laws, the pension reform, the private school issue, all of them get these huge crowds out on the street, hundreds of thousands of people. And I don't know about the CGT today, but the CGT in the 60s and 70s could mobilize 100,000 people just at a word.
Yes.
And so that wasn't completely different. It's just that the scale was so remarkable in 68.
Yeah. Do you think that your experience in 1968 had an impact on how you understand France?
Well, to a degree. I mean, as I just tried to say, I think that I already had this estimate of volatility in France, so it wasn't completely different. What was different is the closeness to being a revolutionary situation as part of my personal experience. Like it didn't influence my career as a researcher, but it sure influenced my career as a teacher, because I'd have in my head those crowd scenes. And this, when I taught about 1830 and 1848 and 1871, I'd be thinking of the crowds at the Stade Charléty.
And in your career, so when 1968 is over, did you return to the States in the fall of 1968?
Yes.
And did you take any of what had happened with you? Did it have any impact on you when you went back to the States?
Well, it prepared me because revolution followed me to the States. And that's, you may be familiar with what happened in 1969 at Cornell.
Mm-hmm.
African-American students took over the Student Union building and they smuggled guns in. So in the spring of 1969, I witnessed another situation which caused a great deal of concern among Cornell faculty and alumni. For one thing, classes were suspended and we had great assemblies, and people then started talking to each other too. And my supervisor, Henry Gerlach, said it reminded him of the Third Estate meeting. And there were members of the faculty who said, well, you can't be afraid to blow a building, by which they meant forcibly remove people from a building.
Right.
And the president of the university tried to resolve it peacefully, and he succeeded at the price of having the students come out with their guns held high. So the alumni in some cases went berserk. There were people who took back their pledges as donors and said that he should have used sheriff's deputies to get people out of the building. And yet he saved lives. I mean, no one was hurt in that episode.
Yeah.
So in a sense, my experiences of 68 sort of meshed with what I encountered in 69.
So it wasn't so frightening for you in 1969 because You had experienced what had happened in France.
Yeah, you probably could say that, yes.
So you mentioned there that that in some ways it had an influence on your teaching career, if not your research career. Do you think that 1968 had an impact on you from a personal or a political perspective?
I don't know if I came out of it being much different politically than I was going into it. And that is, I usually sympathize with the progressive side of things, but on the other hand, I'm a liberal and not a radical. So that I don't think that the events of '68 radicalized me in any way, but on the other hand, I mean, I appreciated the creativity. And it's fun. I mean, if you read Cohn-Bendett's Obsolete Communism, it's fun to read.
Agreed. It certainly is, yeah. And we're almost at the end of the questions. I wondered if, as someone who experienced the events and has an obvious interest in France and French history, I wondered if you had kept an eye on the way in which the story of 1968 has been told over the years.
Well, only in the last few days when I was thinking about this topic, it seems to me from what I've read in the literature, is that the volume of publications keeps expanding every 10 years.
Yep.
And yet at the same time, there are a number of myths created, like those you pointed out, that everything happened in Paris, that the strikes may easily be forgotten when they shouldn't be forgotten. So, I mean, I'm a little bit more aware now that I've read a little bit of the literature.
Okay.
What do you think of Michael Seidman's approach? Do you think he's too critical?
I really like his book. It came out around the same time as my book. I think he's done a lot. There's an awful lot of archival research. And a lot of the police archives have been used, which offers a very interesting perspective. I do think he's perhaps a bit critical, yeah, but he brings a different perspective to the very stereotypical narrative that tends to dominate and has dominated increasingly as the commemorations have progressed. I mean, it would be very interesting to see where we go in 2018, to see what direction the narrative takes. I suppose with the passage of time, the ability of those people who have dominated the narrative, the ability for them to dominate wanes, and the possibility for a more critical perspective becomes more obvious, and that's been happening, and as I think I say in the book, and it starts to happen a lot in 2008, and I think it'll progress. It'll just be interesting to see what angle is taken. The last time in 2008, the international perspective was very much a focus. It'll just be interesting to see where it goes in 2018.
I don't know if anyone has explained thoroughly just what the 60s were about. You know, I mean, there's still mysterious why this all took place at the same time in so many different countries.
Yeah. It's something that I've been involved in a number of other projects, particularly a very big transnational project, which looks at 1968 in Europe, and it's called Europe's 1968, and it's an oral history project, looking at these 16 countries in Europe, with a view to trying to get an understanding as to why it all happened in the same place, or at the same time. So it's yeah, there's still some work to be done, despite the plethora of material that exists. Can I ask you one more thing? So I've asked all the participants in these interviews, if you were given 30 seconds to summarize your experience, how would you do it?
Well, I have to come back to the two words, exhilarating and frightening. Exhilarating because, you know, it's a Wordsworthian moment. Bliss was in that dawn to be alive, but at the same time, where is it all leading? And are we in danger or not? So those are the two aspects. And I certainly feel enriched for having experienced it.